Everyone says the same thing. Renting is throwing money away. But after running the numbers, I realized something shocking. In many situations, renting is actually the smarter financial move. And there is one simple rule that instantly reveals whether you should rent or buy. And almost nobody talks about this rule. But once you understand it, you will never look at home ownership the same way again. And later in this video, I'm going to show you a 30-second calculation that can tell you if buying a house is actually a terrible financial decision. When people compare renting and buying a home, they usually look at just one number, the monthly payment. You'll hear something like this all the time. My rent is $2,000 a month. If I buy a house and the mortgage is also around $2,000, then it's basically the same thing. At first glance, that sounds logical, but the problem is that this comparison is missing most of the real costs of owning a home, because when you rent, the money you lose is very simple. It's just rent payment you send to your landlord every month. Once it's paid, that's the full cost. Owning a home works very differently. Your mortgage payment is only one piece of the total cost. On top of that, there are several over expenses that homeowners have to deal with, expenses that renters never think about. For example, homeowners have to pay property taxes every year just for owning the property. Then there are maintenance costs because houses constantly need repairs, upgrades, or replacements. You also pay interest on your mortgage, which can be a massive cost over time. And finally, there is something called the opportunity cost of your money, which most people completely ignore. And once you start adding these hidden costs together, the real price of owning a home starts to look very different, which brings us to the first cost that most buyers underestimate: property taxes. The first hidden cost of owning a home is property taxes. In the United States, the average property tax is about 1.1% of a home's value every year. This means that simply owning property comes with an ongoing tax bill you have to pay to your local government. Let's look at a simple example. If you own a $500,000 home, 1.1% property tax rate means you'll pay about $5,500 every year in property taxes. And unlike the equity you build in your house, this money is gone forever. It doesn't increase your ownership of the property and you'll never see it again. It's simply part of the cost of owning a home. But property taxes are only the beginning. Homes also require constant maintenance. Things break, wear out, or need to be replaced over time. Roofs need repairs. Appliances stop working. Plumbing fails, and sometimes unexpected issues appear that can cost thousands of dollars. Because of this, financial experts usually recommend setting aside about 1% of the home's value every year, just for maintenance and repairs. For that same $500K, that would be another $5,000 per year. When you combine property taxes and maintenance together, you're already spending around $10,000 per year just to keep the house running before you even consider the mortgage. But here's where things start to get really interesting, because taxes and maintenance aren't actually the biggest cost of owning a home. The real expense comes from something most buyers underestimate: the cost of their money itself. Now let's talk about a cost that almost nobody considers when buying a home: opportunity cost. Opportunity cost simply means the return you could have earned if your money was invested somewhere else. When you buy a home, you usually need a large down payment. Let's say you put $100K down on a house. Once that money goes into the property, it's no longer available to invest in other assets like stocks, index funds, or businesses. In other words, the capital becomes locked into your home. Historically, the stock market has returned around 7% per year on average after inflation. Meanwhile, residential real estate prices have increased at much slower pace, around 2% per year after inflation over the long term. The difference may not seem huge at first, but it adds up quickly. If stocks return about 7% and real estates return around 2%, the difference between the two is roughly 5% per year. So if you invest $100K into a home instead of the stock market, you are potentially giving up about $5,000 per year in lost investment returns. And while that might not feel like a direct expense, financially speaking, it still represents a real cost. But even this isn't the largest expense of owning a home, because the biggest cost comes from something every homeowner has to deal with: mortgage interest. Most people focus on the monthly payment, but what really matters is how much of the payments go toward interest rather than actually owning more of the house. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine you buy a home and borrow 400k with a mortgage rate of around 7%. At that rate, the interest alone can cost roughly 20,000k per year in the early years of the loan. And this is where many buyers get surprised, because even though you are making monthly payments, a large portion of those payments doesn't actually build equity at the beginning. Instead, much of it goes directly toward paying interest to the bank. Just like property taxes and maintenance, that money is gone forever. It doesn't increase your ownership of the property, and it doesn't come back to you later. And once you combine that interest with the other hidden costs we talked about, property taxes, maintenance, and opportunity cost, the total cost of owning a home starts to add up quickly, which brings us to the most moment where everything finally comes together. Because once we add all of these numbers up, we can create one simple rule that reveals the true cost of owning a home. We already looked at property taxes, which average about 1.1% of the home's value each year. Then there is maintenance, which experts estimate at roughly 1% per year to cover repairs, replacements in general, so on. And on top of that comes the cost of capital, which includes the opportunity cost of your down payment and the interest you pay on the mortgage. In many situations, this adds up to around 6.6% per year. When you combine these numbers, something interesting appears. Property taxes 1.1%, maintenance 1%, cost of capital 6.6%. Altogether, the true cost of owning a home comes out to roughly 8.7% of the property's value every year. This idea is often referred to as the 8.7% rule, and it gives you a surprisingly simple way to estimate what home ownership really costs. And once you understand that number, you can use it to quickly compare rating versus buying in almost any market. So, once you understand the 8.7% rule, using it becomes surprisingly simple. All you have to do is take the price of the home, multiply it by 8.7%, and then divide that number by 12 months. This gives you a rough estimate of the true monthly cost of owning that property. For example, imagine a home that costs 400k. If we multiply 400k by 8.7%, we get about 34,000 per year in total ownership costs. Now divide it by 12 months, and the result is roughly 2,900 per month. In other words, even if the mortgage payment alone looks lower, the true financial cost of the owning that house is closer to 2,900 every month. And this is where the rule becomes useful. If you can rent a similar home in the same area for less than that amount, then from a purely financial perspective, renting might actually be the smarter choice. But numbers alone don't tell the entire story of the home ownership. But the advantages don't only exist on the ownership side. When you look at the other option, renting also comes with benefits that many people value just as much. One of the biggest advantages is flexibility. When you rent, you are not tied to a property for decades. If your job changes, you want to move to another city, or your life situation shifts, it's usually much easier to relocate. Instead of being locked into a long-term commitment, you have the freedom to adapt quickly. At the same time, renting removes many of the responsibilities that come with owning a home. Renters typically don't have to worry about property taxes, maintenance costs, or unexpected repairs that can suddenly cost thousands of dollars. Those expenses are usually handled by the landlord, and in many cities, renting can even provide access to amenities that would be extremely expensive to own individually. Things like gyms, pools, security, or shared spaces, which is why the real question isn't simply whether renting or buying is better. It's about understanding which option makes the most sense for your situation. When you put everything together, the answer to renting versus buying becomes pretty simple. It depends on the numbers. Right now, in many markets, high mortgage rates mean renting can actually be cheaper in the short term. But if you plan to stay somewhere for 5 to 10 years or more, buying a home can still become a strong long-term investment as you build equity and benefit from potential price appreciation. So, real lesson is simple. Don't follow options, don't assume buying is always better. Run the numbers, because when it comes to money decisions like this, the smartest choice almost always come down to math.